Good evening. Soviet President Gorbachev is flying to China at this hour. He should arrive about 11 p.m. Eastern Time, flying to Beijing for the first Sino-Soviet summit meeting in 30 years. But even as China's communist leaders prepare to receive the Soviet communist leader, they've had to contend with students demanding democratic reforms. Jim Laurie has the latest from Beijing on the prospective summit and the students' own preparations for it.
As the students saw it, by gathering in the very place where Mikhail Gorbachev will be greeted tomorrow, they were forcing the government to talk, to negotiate. If it didn't, the Chinese campaign for democracy threatened to make the leadership lose face. During the day, student leaders met with the education minister, but still the rally in Tiananmen Square went on. With the government anxious to end the protest yet reluctant to use force, it was a standoff. As dawn Monday broke in Beijing, the students announced they'd moved to one side of the square to make way for Gorbachev. The slogans hoisted Sunday spoke of China and the Soviet Union coming together, not only in establishing normal relations, but in political thinking too. In both Russian and Chinese, democracy, our mutual dream, this banner read. And students we spoke to complained that Moscow was ahead of Beijing in political reform.
Reform in Soviet Union is much more well organized than that in China.
We think that in China, we also can borrow something from the Soviet Union.
While the Chinese here may feel there is something to learn from Gorbachev's glasnost, the Soviets this coming week will be looking carefully at something else: the progress of 10 years of Chinese economic reform. Nowhere are these changes more apparent than along the Sino-Soviet border. Here, just 20 years ago, the Chinese and Soviets were skirmishing. Today, Russian children are learning Chinese. Chinese workers are building Russian homes. The Soviets, who now go back and forth across the border, are bringing home superior Chinese consumer goods. Customs officers say, usually,
Video, yes, and the tape records too.
And what they buy points up the terrible shortages the Russians suffer. Here, even loading Chinese potatoes, a staple of the Russian diet, now in short supply. So the two communist giants are coming together at a time when both are changing their ways, using capitalist means to reform their economies and moving to a greater expression of democracy. And though it would not be said publicly, the two sides, who have been at odds for 30 years, have reached a kind of agreement that communism, as they used to know it, doesn't really work and must be changed. Jim Laurie, ABC News, Beijing.
As Gorbachev was flying to China, top U.S. State Department officials were striking back at the Soviets' latest effort to win European favor on the issue of short-range missiles stationed there. Yesterday, Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze seemed to threaten that if Washington continues to oppose negotiations now on reducing short-range missiles, Moscow will either build a new missile force or stop removing missiles it has already agreed to dismantle. Details on the State Department reaction from David Ensor.
The Soviet foreign minister's threat was portrayed by the Bush administration today as a clear attempt to divide the NATO alliance.
The Soviet Union spent the last 10 years modernizing its short-range nuclear forces. They have an advantage over us, depending on how you count the numbers, of between 12 and 16 to 1 as it now stands in Europe with regard to these short-range systems. So his making threats about a new modernization after having spent 10 years at it is a little bit unimpressive.
Administration officials fanned out today to try to limit the public relations damage of the latest Soviet moves.
It would be a terrible mistake if we fall into the trap of playing politics with Western security. And the Russians would dearly love to see that happen.
The United States, Baker added pointedly, prefers quiet diplomacy over going after public relations victories. After all, this is the administration of a president who, in his first major foreign policy speech Friday, avoided any bold initiatives responding to Mikhail Gorbachev. His reaction to the Soviet leader?
Mr. Gorbachev, don't stop now.
But critics charge that Bush is missing a historic opportunity, one that may not last forever.
Well, I thought this was a disappointingly pallid response to Mr. Gorbachev's initiatives. I think it will disappoint our allies. It seemed to me that he should have come up with something more positive.
With the NATO meeting set for later this month, so far, only the British government publicly supports the U.S. on modernization of short-range nuclear weapons. The West Germans want no new missiles on either side, and they insist that Gorbachev should be taken at his word when he says he wants to end the Cold War. David Ensor, ABC News, the State Department.
On the subject of public relations and whether Gorbachev is way ahead of the United States in seizing the moment, both Secretary Baker and Deputy Secretary Eagleburger professed today not to be worried. But behind that profession came hints of concern and action. Baker said, "There are things we're thinking of that are not yet in the public eye." And Eagleburger was even more direct. "We're working on it," he said.
World News Sunday.